The morning shift at Magnolia's diner started like any other Tuesday for Sarah Chen. She tied her apron strings behind her back while standing in front of the cloudy bathroom mirror, smoothing down the wrinkles in her uniform that no amount of ironing seemed to fix anymore. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she checked her reflection one last time, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Her eyes looked tired, shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from working double shifts and staying up late helping her daughter with homework. Sarah had been working at Magnolia's for almost 3 years now, ever since her husband David walked out on their marriage. He left on a rainy Thursday evening, said he needed to find himself, whatever that meant. What he found was a new life in California with a woman he met online, leaving Sarah alone in their small Georgia town with their 7-year-old daughter Emma, and a mountain of debt that seemed to grow taller every month. The divorce papers came 6 months later, along with promises of child support that arrived sporadically at best. The diner itself was a relic from another era, with red vinyl booths that had been patched so many times they looked like quilts, and a long chrome counter that reflected the faces of the regulars who came in every morning for coffee and conversation. The walls were decorated with old photographs of the town's history, faded images of Main Street when it was still thriving, before the factory closed and took most of the good jobs with it. Now Magnolia's was one of the few places left in town where people still gathered, where the coffee was always hot and the pie was homemade. Sarah pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and greeted Miguel, the line cook who had worked at Magnolia's longer than anyone could remember. He was already at the grill, the familiar sizzle of bacon filling the air with its smoky scent. Miguel nodded at her with a warm smile, his weathered face creasing with the kind of kindness that made the hard days bearable. They had developed an easy rhythm over the years, communicating with glances and gestures during the rush hours when orders piled up and customers grew impatient. The early morning regulars were already settling into their usual spots. There was Harold, a retired postal worker who always sat at the counter and ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast. Betty and Frank, married for 42 years, shared the corner booth and split a stack of pancakes while reading different sections of the newspaper. Young Tommy, who worked nights at the gas station, stumbled in looking half asleep, desperate for the strongest coffee Sarah could pour. These were her people, the constants in a life that often felt uncertain. Sarah moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering plates of steaming food, refilling coffee cups and making small talk about the weather, about the high school football team's chances this season, about Mrs. Henderson's new grandbaby. The work was repetitive, but it was honest, and on good days the tips were enough to cover Emma's school supplies or a tank of gas. On bad days, Sarah counted pennies and made difficult choices about which bills to pay first. The diner started to empty out as the breakfast rush ended and the clock crept toward mid-morning. Sarah was wiping down table 4, where a family with 3 young children had left a mess of syrup and crumbs, when the bell above the door chimed. She glanced up and immediately noticed the man who walked in was different from their typical customers. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and he wore polished leather shoes that clicked against the checkered linoleum floor as he walked. Everything about him spoke of wealth and refinement, from the elegant watch on his wrist to the confident way he carried himself. He looked around the diner with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and nostalgia. The man chose a booth near the window, sliding into the seat with careful precision as if he was afraid the old vinyl might soil his expensive clothes. Sarah grabbed a menu and a glass of water, crossing the diner to greet her new customer. Up close, she could see he was probably in his late 60s, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was lined but distinguished, the kind of aging that came with power and privilege. "Good morning," Sarah said with her practiced waitress smile, the one that was friendly but not too familiar. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" The man looked up at her and for a brief moment something flickered across his face. "Please," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "Black, no sugar." Sarah poured his coffee from the pot she carried, the dark liquid steaming as it filled the thick ceramic mug. The man wrapped his hands around the cup as if warming them, even though the late September morning was mild. He stared out the window at the quiet street beyond, at the empty storefronts and the faded awnings of businesses that had closed years ago. "Take your time looking at the menu," Sarah said. "I'll be back in a few minutes to take your order." She returned to the counter where Miguel was prepping for the lunch shift, chopping vegetables with the quick, precise movements of someone who had done this work for decades. Sarah busied herself rolling silverware into paper napkins, but she found her attention drifting back to the man in the booth. There was something about him that felt out of place, like a page from a different book accidentally inserted into their story. When she returned to his table, the man had barely glanced at the menu. "I'll have the pancakes," he said. "And more coffee, please." Sarah wrote down his order and topped off his mug. The man went back to staring out the window, his expression distant and contemplative. Sarah wondered what brought someone like him to Magnolias, to their forgotten little town where nothing much happened and even less changed. Maybe his car broke down, or maybe he was lost, and this was just a convenient place to stop while he figured out where he was going. The lunch crowd began trickling in around 11:30. Workers from the remaining businesses on Main Street, a few teachers from the elementary school, some retirees who came for the daily special, and the company. Sarah fell into the familiar rhythm of taking orders, delivering food, clearing plates, and making sure everyone had what they needed. The man in the expensive suit remained at his booth, his single order of pancakes sitting mostly untouched on the plate in front of him. Sarah noticed he had pulled out a leather notebook and was writing in it with a fountain pen, the kind she had only seen in old movies. Every so often he would pause and look around the diner, his gaze lingering on details like the vintage Coca-Cola sign on the wall or the old jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. Once their eyes met across the room and Sarah felt an odd jolt, as if he was seeing something in her that she didn't know was there. The afternoon stretched on and the lunch crowd eventually dispersed, leaving behind empty tables and a decent collection of tips in Sarah's apron pocket. She counted them quickly during a lull, her heart sinking a little at the total. It had been a slow day, and slow days meant tough choices. Emma needed new shoes, her old ones were so worn that the sole was starting to separate, but the electric bill was also due and Sarah was already 2 weeks late on that payment. The man in the booth finally stood up around 2 o'clock, closing his leather notebook and tucking it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He walked to the register where Sarah was standing, pulling out a sleek black wallet. The bill came to $8.50, a modest amount that seemed almost comical compared to the obvious wealth this man possessed. Sarah rang up his order and handed him the receipt. The man placed a $10 bill on the counter, then paused. He looked at Sarah with those penetrating blue eyes, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something. But instead, he simply nodded and walked toward the door. The bell chimed as he left, and through the window Sarah watched him climb into a gleaming black Mercedes that was parked on the street. She turned back to the register and picked up the $10 bill, pulling out change to place in the tip jar they kept for dividing at the end of shifts. But when she looked at the counter where the man had been standing, there was nothing else. No extra bills, no coins left beside the receipt, zero tip on an $8.50 check. Sarah felt a familiar sting of disappointment. It wasn't the first time someone had stiffed her, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was something particularly galling about a man who clearly had money to spare, leaving nothing for the person who served him. She thought about his expensive suit, his luxury car, his leather notebook and fountain pen. She thought about Emma's worn-out shoes and the electric bill she couldn't pay. "It's fine," Sarah muttered to herself, shoving the change into her apron pocket. She had learned long ago not to let these things get to her, not to make assumptions about why people did what they did. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he was from somewhere that tipping wasn't customary. Maybe he was just cheap. It didn't matter. She had other tables to clean and the dinner shift would start soon. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks. Sarah refilled ketchup bottles and wiped down menus, swept the floor and helped Miguel prep vegetables for the evening special. Her feet ached in her old sneakers and her lower back had that familiar twinge that came from hours of standing and carrying heavy plates. But she pushed through it the way she always did, because there was no other choice. Emma would be getting out of school soon, and Sarah's shift would end just in time for her to pick up her daughter and head home. At 3:30, Sarah clocked out and untied her apron, stuffing it into her locker in the small break room. She grabbed her purse and headed out to her car, a 15-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door and a temperamental starter that sometimes required multiple attempts before the engine turned over. Today it started on the second try, and Sarah whispered a small thank you to whatever gods looked after struggling single mothers and their unreliable vehicles. The elementary school was only a 10-minute drive from the diner, through neighborhoods where the houses gradually shifted from rundown to modest to almost nice. Sarah's apartment was in one of the rundown areas, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that had been built in the 70s and not updated much since. But it was home, and it was theirs, and Sarah had done her best to make it warm and welcoming for Emma despite the stained carpets and the heater that rattled and the neighbors upstairs who fought loudly at all hours. Emma was waiting outside the school with her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, her pink backpack almost as big as she was. When she saw Sarah's car, her face lit up with that pure, unself-conscious joy that made all the hard work and long hours worthwhile. Emma ran to the car and climbed into the backseat, chattering immediately about her day, about the art project they did in class, about how her friend Sophia brought cupcakes for her birthday and they were chocolate with rainbow sprinkles. Sarah listened and asked questions, smiling at Emma's enthusiasm even as her mind calculated the evening ahead. Homework first, then dinner, then maybe they could watch one episode of Emma's favorite show before bedtime. There was also laundry to do and dishes to wash and a stack of bills that Sarah had been avoiding looking at too closely, because the numbers made her chest tight with anxiety. They arrived home and Emma dumped her backpack by the door, immediately heading to the small table in the kitchen where she did her homework. Sarah started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator for dinner, something simple with pasta and the vegetables she had brought home from the diner. Miguel often let her take home produce that was getting close to its sell-by date, a kindness that Sarah was deeply grateful for even if she was sometimes too proud to say so. As Emma worked on her math worksheet, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked it up, expecting maybe a message from her friend Lisa or a reminder about an upcoming bill. But the message was from an unknown number, just a single line of text that made no sense. Check the piano. Sarah frowned at her phone, reading the message again. Check the piano. What piano? She didn't own a piano. The text had to be a mistake, meant for someone else. She deleted it and went back to cooking, pushing the strange message out of her mind. Dinner was ready by 6, and Sarah and Emma sat at their small kitchen table eating pasta with vegetables while Emma talked about her upcoming school project on butterflies. She wanted to make a poster with pictures and facts, and could they maybe go to the library this weekend to find some books? Sarah agreed, making a mental note to check the library hours and maybe see if they had time to stop by the park afterward if the weather held. After dinner, Emma took her bath and changed into her pajamas decorated with stars and moons. They cuddled on the couch and watched an episode of Emma's show, a cartoon about magical creatures that Sarah had seen so many times she could recite the dialogue. But she never complained, never let Emma see how tired she was, because these moments were precious and fleeting, and Sarah knew that someday Emma would be too old to want to cuddle with her mom on the couch. At 8:30, Sarah tucked Emma into bed, reading her a chapter from the book they were working through together. Emma's eyes were already drooping by the time Sarah finished, and she kissed her daughter's forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door cracked open just the way Emma liked it. Back in the kitchen, Sarah finally forced herself to look at the stack of bills on the counter. Electric bill, phone bill, credit card statement, medical bill from Emma's checkup last month. The numbers swam before her eyes and she felt that familiar weight settling over her chest. She made less than $30,000 a year at the diner, and even with the child support when it came, which was maybe 6 months out of 12, there was never enough. Never enough to get ahead, never enough to save, barely enough to scrape by. Sarah thought about the man in the expensive suit, about his $0 tip on an $8.50 check. She thought about how unfair it was that some people had so much while others worked themselves to exhaustion and still couldn't make ends meet. But then she pushed those thoughts away because bitterness wouldn't pay the bills and resentment wouldn't put new shoes on Emma's feet. She was sorting through the mail when her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. The piano at 1847 Willowbrook Drive, Thursday evening 7 o'clock, come alone. Sarah's heart started beating faster. This wasn't a wrong number. Someone was deliberately sending her these messages. But who? And why? She didn't know anyone at 1847 Willowbrook Drive. She didn't know anything about a piano. Was this some kind of prank? Some kind of scam? She typed back a response. Who is this? The reply came almost immediately. Someone who wants to help. Thursday at 7, please come. Sarah stared at her phone, her mind racing. This had to be a setup of some kind. Maybe identity theft, or someone trying to lure her to an empty house to rob her, or worse. She should delete these messages and block the number. She should forget this ever happened. But another part of her, a smaller, more desperate part, wondered what if it was real? What if someone really did want to help? What if there was something at that address that could change her circumstances, even a little bit? She thought about Emma's shoes, about the electric bill, about the constant stress of never having enough. Sarah sat at her kitchen table for a long time, turning her phone over in her hands, trying to decide what to do. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the couple upstairs arguing again, their voices rising and falling in a familiar pattern. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. Emma sighed in her sleep down the hall. Finally, Sarah did what she always did when she was unsure. She called her best friend Lisa, who answered on the third ring sounding out of breath like she had been running. Hey Sarah, what's up? Lisa asked. Sarah explained about the strange text messages, about the address and the piano and the instruction to come alone. As she talked, she could hear how crazy it all sounded, how much like the beginning of a true crime podcast. Lisa predictably told her she was insane if she was even considering going. Sarah, think about it, Lisa said, her voice firm. Someone sends you cryptic messages telling you to go to a random address alone. That's like horror movie 101. Don't do it. I know, Sarah said. You're right, it's probably nothing, probably some creep or a scam, but something in her voice must have given her away because Lisa sighed heavily. You're thinking about going anyway, aren't you? Sarah didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the man in the suit, about the way he had looked at her, about the strange feeling she had gotten when their eyes met. What if it was him? What if this was somehow connected to his visit to the diner? Promise me something, Lisa said. If you go, and I really hope you don't, but if you go, promise me you'll tell me where you're going and when. And keep your phone on. And if anything feels even slightly wrong, you get out of there immediately. Sarah promised, even though she still hadn't decided if she was actually going to go. She thanked Lisa and hung up, then looked at the text message again. Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. That gave her 2 days to think about it, 2 days to decide if she was brave enough or desperate enough or foolish enough to follow through. Wednesday at the diner was busier than Tuesday had been. A bus tour stopped in town for lunch, filling the diner with elderly tourists who wanted to know the history of every building on Main Street and took forever to decide what to order. Sarah's feet were killing her by the end of her shift, but the tips were better than usual, and she allowed herself a small moment of relief as she counted out the bills in her apron pocket. Maybe she could pay the electric bill and get Emma those shoes after all. But that night, as she lay in bed unable to sleep, Sarah's thoughts kept returning to the mysterious text messages. Who sent them? Why her? What was waiting at 1847 Willowbrook Drive? She had looked up the address on her phone, using the Street View feature to see the house. It was a large, beautiful home in one of the nicer neighborhoods across town, the kind of place Sarah had only ever seen from the outside while driving past. The kind of place that had a circular driveway and professional landscaping and windows that gleamed in the sunlight. Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched Sarah's unsettled mood. She went through her shift at the diner on autopilot, mixing up orders and forgetting to refill coffee cups, earning a few irritated looks from customers. Miguel asked if she was feeling okay, and Sarah assured him she was fine, just tired. But the truth was she couldn't stop thinking about the evening ahead, about the decision she still hadn't made. At 3:30, Sarah clocked out and drove to pick up Emma from school. They went through their usual evening routine, homework and dinner and bath time and stories. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere, calculating time and distance and risk. If she was going to go to Willowbrook Drive, she would need to find someone to watch Emma. She couldn't take her daughter with her, not when she had no idea what she was walking into. At 6:15, Sarah called Lisa again. Her friend answered, sounding resigned, as if she already knew what Sarah was going to ask. You're really doing this, aren't you? Lisa said. I have to know, Sarah replied. I can't explain it, but I have to know what this is about. Lisa agreed to come over and stay with Emma, but she made Sarah promise again to be careful, to keep her phone on, to leave immediately if anything seemed dangerous. Sarah agreed to everything, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. Lisa arrived at 6:45, and Sarah explained to Emma that she had to run a quick errand but would be back soon. Emma, absorbed in her coloring book, barely looked up. Sarah grabbed her jacket and her phone, checked that it was fully charged, and headed out to her car. The drive across town to Willowbrook Drive took about 20 minutes. Sarah's hands were shaking on the steering wheel and she had to remind herself to breathe normally. This was crazy. Lisa was right. She should turn around and go home. Nothing good came from mysterious text messages and cryptic instructions. But she kept driving, following the directions on her phone until she turned onto Willowbrook Drive. The houses here were set back from the street, surrounded by tall trees and well-maintained lawns. Sarah counted the numbers until she reached 1847, pulling up to the curb and staring at the house through her rain-speckled windshield. It was even more impressive in person than it had been on the street view. A two-story colonial with white columns and black shutters, the kind of house Sarah had dreamed about when she was younger, before life taught her that dreams were luxuries that people like her couldn't afford. There were lights on inside, warm yellow glows visible through the curtained windows. Sarah sat in her car for a full 5 minutes trying to gather her courage. Her phone showed 7:02, she was already late. If she was going to do this, it had to be now. She grabbed her phone, made sure the ringer was on and the volume was up, then climbed out of her car. The rain had slowed to a light mist and the air smelled like wet leaves in approaching autumn. Sarah walked up the curved driveway to the front door, her sneakers quiet on the brick pavers. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, her knuckles inches from the dark wood. This is insane, she whispered to herself. Completely insane. But before she could talk herself out of it, before she could turn around and run back to her car and her normal life and her safe, predictable routine, the door opened. And standing there, looking exactly as he had 2 days ago in his expensive suit and polished shoes, was the man from the diner. The man who had left her no tip. The man who had sat in the booth by the window and stared out at the quiet street while writing in his leather notebook. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice the same deep, cultured tone she remembered. "Thank you for coming. Please come in, we have a lot to talk about. Please come in, we have a lot to talk about." Sarah enters the mansion and meets the billionaire Robert Harrison, who reveals he knew her late father, Michael Chen, from their childhood in this very town. Robert explains he left town 50 years ago to build his fortune in tech and real estate, but recently returned after his wife's death. He watched Sarah at the diner and saw in her the same quiet dignity her father possessed. Robert leads her to a grand piano in the music room and asks her to look underneath it. There, taped to the bottom, is an envelope. Inside, $50,000 in cashier's checks and a letter explaining this is the first installment of what Robert calls his Paying It Forward project. He wants to help Sarah because her father once helped him in a crucial moment during their youth, a kindness Robert never forgot but never had the chance to repay before her father died. Sarah is overwhelmed, skeptical, and unsure whether to accept. Robert explains there is one condition for the money. Sarah must use it not just for immediate needs but to pursue a dream she's buried. Through their conversation, he learns Sarah once wanted to become a nurse but dropped out of community college when she got pregnant with Emma. The money is meant to give her a fresh start, pay off debts, stabilize her life, and return to school. Robert offers to cover her tuition and living expenses for 2 years while she completes her nursing degree, but she must commit fully to changing her life's trajectory. Sarah is torn between pride, disbelief, and hope. She asks for time to think. Robert agrees but tells her time is limited. He's been diagnosed with terminal cancer and has perhaps a year to live. He wants to see his projects through while he still can. Sarah leaves the mansion with the envelope, her mind spinning. Sarah spends sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. She confides in Lisa, who encourages her to accept. Sarah researches Robert Harrison online and discovers he's a legitimate billionaire philanthropist, lending credibility to his story. She also finds her father's old photos and discovers one of young Michael with a boy who could be Robert, proof of their connection. Sarah returns to Robert's mansion and accepts his offer with gratitude and determination. Over the next 3 months, Sarah's life transforms. She pays off her debts, quits the diner, enrolls in nursing school, and moves with Emma to a modest but comfortable apartment near campus. Robert becomes an unexpected mentor and friend, meeting with Sarah monthly to discuss her progress. Emma flourishes in their new stability. Sarah discovers she's excellent at nursing and finds deep fulfillment in the work. During one visit to Robert's home, Sarah discovers she's not the only person he's helping. She meets Marcus, a formerly homeless veteran Robert is helping get back on his feet and into a job training program, and Yolanda, a talented teenage artist from a broken home whose college education Robert is funding. Robert explains his legacy project. He's identified dozens of people in their forgotten town who have potential but lack opportunity. He's systematically changing their lives with strategic financial help and mentorship. But Robert is racing against time. His cancer is progressing faster than expected. Sarah witnesses his physical decline even as his determination intensifies. She begins to understand that Robert's mission isn't just about charity, it's about proving that people aren't poor because they lack talent or work ethic, but because they lack access and opportunity. His project is both personal redemption and social experiment. Sarah is thriving in nursing school when disaster strikes. Emma becomes seriously ill with pneumonia and is hospitalized. Sarah is devastated and terrified, nearly dropping out to care for her daughter full-time. Robert, now visibly weakened by his illness, visits Emma in the hospital and sits with Sarah through the worst nights. His presence and encouragement keep Sarah from giving up on her dreams. Emma slowly recovers, and Sarah realizes she's not alone anymore. She has a community now, including Robert, Lisa, and the other recipients of Robert's help who rally around her. Meanwhile, Robert's health takes a sharp downturn. He's hospitalized and doctors give him only weeks to live. Sarah visits him daily, reading to him and updating him on her studies. In a poignant moment, Robert tells Sarah she's already accomplished what he hoped. She's proven to herself and to Emma that their circumstances don't define their possibilities. Robert passes away peacefully with Sarah at his bedside. At his funeral, Sarah is shocked to discover the full scope of his legacy project. Over 200 people from the town attend, each one someone Robert helped in some way. Some received education funding, others business loans, housing assistance, or job training. The forgotten town is being quietly transformed by Robert's systematic generosity. Robert's attorney reveals that Robert has left Sarah an additional surprise: a trust fund for Emma's future education, and a request that Sarah, once she completes her nursing degree, consider working at a free clinic Robert has funded in town. The clinic is designed to serve the working poor, people like Sarah once was, who fall through the cracks of the healthcare system. Robert's will also includes a letter to Sarah explaining that her father once talked a teenage Robert out of suicide after Robert's mother died. That single act of compassion set Robert on a different path, and he never forgot it. Sarah Chen stood in front of the full-length mirror in her small bedroom, adjusting the collar of her new navy blue scrubs. The fabric was crisp and fresh, still creased from the package, and the embroidered name tag over her left breast pocket read Sarah Chen, RN in neat white letters. She ran her fingers over the stitching, still hardly able to believe it was real, that those letters represented 2 years of sleepless nights studying pharmacology and anatomy, countless hours in clinical rotations, and the determination to prove to herself and to Emma that their lives could be different. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 2 years and 3 months since that rainy Thursday evening, when she had driven across town to a mansion on Willowbrook Drive and discovered that miracles could come in unexpected forms. The anniversary of Robert's death had passed just 2 weeks ago, marked by a quiet visit to his grave where Sarah had placed a bouquet of white lilies, and told him about her graduation, about Emma's progress in school, about the life he had made possible. Today was Sarah's first official day at the Robert Harrison Memorial Clinic, and the nervous excitement fluttering in her stomach reminded her of her first day at Magnolia's Diner all those years ago, except everything felt different now. She wasn't walking into work out of desperation and necessity. She was walking into her calling, into work that mattered, into a role where she could make a real difference in people's lives. Emma appeared in the doorway of Sarah's bedroom, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was 9 now, taller and more confident than the quiet 7-year-old who used to do homework at their cramped kitchen table while Sarah worried about which bill to pay first. Emma's eyes were bright with pride as she looked at her mother in her nursing scrubs. "You look like a real nurse, Mom," Emma said, grinning. "I am a real nurse," Sarah replied, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Can you believe it?" Emma squeezed her tight. "Mr. Harrison would be so proud of you." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Robert was mentioned. The grief had softened over time but never fully disappeared. He had lived long enough to see her complete her first year of nursing school, long enough to meet some of the patients she had cared for during her clinical rotations, long enough to know that his investment in her future had not been misplaced. But he had died 3 months before her graduation, his body finally surrendering to the cancer that had been eating away at him since before Sarah ever met him. "I think he would be," Sarah said softly. "I hope he would be." They drove together to Emma's school, the morning sun casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets of their neighborhood. Sarah's apartment now was in a different part of town, nothing fancy but clean and safe, with 2 proper bedrooms and a kitchen where the appliances all worked. Emma had her own space to do homework, to play, to be a kid, without the constant weight of her mother's stress pressing down on the household. Sarah watched Emma skip toward the school entrance, turning back once to wave with that unself-conscious enthusiasm that made Sarah's heart swell. So much had changed, but Emma's joy remained constant, perhaps even brighter now that she no longer sensed her mother's perpetual anxiety about money and bills and making ends meet. The drive from Emma's school to the clinic took 15 minutes through the old part of town, where Sarah had spent most of her life. She passed the apartment complex, where she and Emma had lived in that cramped 2-bedroom with the stained carpets and rattling heater. Someone else struggled there now, someone else lay awake at night worrying about electricity bills and worn-out shoes. Sarah felt a pang of something between guilt and gratitude, wondering why she had been chosen for Robert's help when so many others needed it just as desperately. But she knew the answer. Robert had explained it to her during one of their many conversations in his library, while he sipped tea that he could barely keep down, and Sarah told him about her classes. His project was never about saving everyone. It was about proving that the right help at the right time could change the trajectory of a life, that poverty was not a moral failing but a circumstantial trap that could be escaped with resources and opportunity. He had chosen people with potential and determination who just needed a door to open. Sarah was one of dozens, maybe hundreds, who represented Robert's theory about human potential and systemic inequality. The Robert Harrison Memorial Clinic sat on a corner lot where an abandoned grocery store had once moldered. Robert had purchased the building 2 years before his death and oversaw its complete renovation into a modern medical facility designed specifically to serve the working poor of their community. The exterior was simple but welcoming, with large windows that let in natural light and a wheelchair ramp leading to the main entrance. A sign out front displayed the clinic's mission statement in bold letters: quality healthcare for everyone, regardless of ability to pay. Sarah pulled into the small parking lot and sat in her car for a moment, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. This was it. This was the beginning of the life she had once only dreamed about, the life Robert had insisted she deserved. She thought about the Sarah who had served him pancakes 2 years ago, exhausted and hopeless, seeing nothing ahead but more of the same grinding poverty. That Sarah could never have imagined this moment. Inside, the clinic was already buzzing with activity. The waiting room was nearly full, people sitting in chairs filling out paperwork or thumbing through magazines. Sarah recognized the faces of struggle, the worn clothes and tired eyes, the body language of people who had learned not to expect much from the world. She had worn that same expression for years. "Sarah," a voice called out, and she turned to see Dr. Patricia Acaffer striding toward her with a warm smile. Dr. Acaffer was the clinic's medical director, a woman in her 50s who had left a lucrative private practice to run Robert's vision of accessible healthcare. She had interviewed Sarah for the position and had been instrumental in helping Sarah navigate her final year of nursing school. "Welcome to your first day," Dr. Acaffer said, shaking Sarah's hand firmly. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied, returning the smile. Dr. Acaffer led Sarah on a quick tour of the facility, pointing out exam rooms and the lab and the small pharmacy where patients could get prescriptions filled at cost. The staff was small but dedicated, a mix of nurses and medical assistants and administrative workers who all shared a commitment to the clinic's mission. Sarah met her fellow nurses, including a woman named Jennifer who would be training her for the first few weeks. The morning passed in a whirlwind of patient intake and vital signs and electronic medical records. Sarah worked alongside Jennifer, learning the clinic's systems and protocols, meeting patients who came in for everything from diabetes management to infected wounds to pregnancy tests. Each person carried a story of struggle and resilience, and Sarah found herself connecting with them in ways she never could have before her own experience of hardship and transformation. During a brief lull around 11, Sarah stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts when Jennifer appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee from the break room. "You're doing great," Jennifer said, handing Sarah one of the cups. "First days are always overwhelming, but you're handling it like you've been here for months." Sarah thanked her and sipped the coffee, which was strong and hot and exactly what she needed. She thought about all the coffee she had poured at Magnolia's, all those mornings serving the same regulars who knew her name and her story. She wondered if any of them knew about her transformation, if Miguel still worked the grill, if the diner was still standing, or if it had finally succumbed to the economic decline that had claimed so many other businesses in town. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, turning to Jennifer. "Do you ever feel guilty, being on this side of things, I mean? Having a good job and stability when so many people out there are still struggling?" Jennifer looked at her thoughtfully. "Every single day," she said, "but then I remember that guilt doesn't help anyone. Action helps, showing up and doing the work helps, being present for people who need care helps." Dr. Acaffer told me something when I first started here that stuck with me. She said we can't save everyone, but we can save someone, and that someone matters. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into her chest. That was what Robert had understood, what his entire legacy project had been built on. Individual lives mattered. Individual transformations created ripples that spread outward in ways that couldn't always be measured or predicted. The afternoon brought more patients, including a young mother with 2 small children who needed vaccinations. The woman looked exhausted and overwhelmed, juggling a toddler on her hip while trying to fill out paperwork with her other hand. Sarah recognized herself in that woman, saw the same desperation in her eyes that Sarah had once felt. "Let me help you with that," Sarah said gently, taking the clipboard. "Why don't you tell me the information and I'll write it down for you?" The woman looked at her with such gratitude that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Such a small gesture, but it made all the difference in that moment. That was what this work was about, Sarah realized. Not grand gestures or life-changing miracles, but small acts of compassion and dignity that acknowledged people's worth and humanity. After the vaccinations were complete and the children had been bribed with stickers and lollipops, the young mother gathered her things to leave. Sarah walked her to the lobby and held the door open. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "Everyone here has been so kind. I don't have insurance and I was so worried about how I was going to afford their shots." "That's what we're here for," Sarah replied. "You can always come back if you need anything." As the woman left with her children, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the pieces of her life had finally aligned into the pattern they were always meant to form. This was where she belonged, doing this work, helping people who reminded her of who she had been. The day ended around 6, and Sarah completed her paperwork and said goodbye to the staff. Dr. Acaffer stopped her on the way out. "You did excellent work today, Sarah," she said. "I think you're going to be a real asset to this clinic." "Thank you, Dr. Acaffer," Sarah replied. "I can't tell you how much this opportunity means to me." Robert knew what he was doing when he set this all up, Dr. Acaffer said. He had a gift for seeing potential in people that they couldn't see in themselves. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The grief was still there, still raw in unexpected moments. Emma was waiting at Lisa's house when Sarah picked her up, full of stories about her day at school. Lisa made them stay for dinner, a casual meal of spaghetti and salad while Emma and Lisa's son played video games in the living room. Lisa and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, and Sarah talked about her first day at the clinic, about the patients she had met and the work she had done. "You're glowing," Lisa observed. "I haven't seen you this happy in years." "I feel like I'm finally doing what I'm supposed to be doing," Sarah said. "Like everything that happened before was leading to this." "Robert would be proud," Lisa said, echoing Emma's words from the morning. That night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about the past 2 years. She thought about the night Robert had died, holding his hand in the hospital while he slipped away peacefully in his sleep. She thought about his funeral, where she had met so many other people whose lives he had changed. She thought about Marcus, the veteran who now worked in construction and had bought his own small house. She thought about Yolanda, the artist who was thriving at a prestigious art school on the East Coast. Robert's attorney had explained the full scope of his legacy project at the reading of the will. Over 200 people had received some form of assistance, from education funding to business loans to housing support. The investments totaled tens of millions of dollars, all carefully documented and tracked. Robert had kept detailed files on each recipient, monitoring their progress and adjusting his help as needed. It was systematic generosity on a scale that Sarah had never imagined possible. And she was part of that legacy now, not just as a recipient but as an agent of change. The clinic was Robert's largest single project, designed to serve thousands of people over the years. Every patient Sarah helped, every life she touched, was an extension of Robert's vision and compassion. Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a folder she had been working on for several months. It was her own small version of Robert's legacy project, a system she was developing to help her patients connect with resources they might not know existed. She had compiled information about food banks and utility assistance programs and free legal services and job training opportunities. She was learning to identify which patients might benefit from which resources, how to offer help without seeming patronizing or intrusive. It wasn't much, not compared to what Robert had done, but it was something. It was her way of paying forward what had been given to her. The next morning was Wednesday, Sarah's day off from the clinic. She had promised herself she would use her free days to rest and spend time with Emma, but there was something she needed to do first, something that had been nagging at her for weeks. After dropping Emma at school, Sarah drove across town to Main Street, to the familiar block where Magnolia's Diner still stood. She had driven past it a few times since starting nursing school but had never stopped, afraid of the memories and the emotions that might overwhelm her. But today felt different. Today she felt strong enough to face her past. The diner looked exactly the same, as if the last 2 years had never happened. The red neon sign still flickered in the window. The parking spaces out front were filled with the same old pickup trucks and sedans that had always been there. Sarah parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. The booths were still patched vinyl, the counter still gleaming chrome, the jukebox still broken in the corner. Sarah felt like she was stepping back in time, into the life she had lived before everything changed. Miguel was at the grill, older and grayer but still moving with the same efficient grace. He looked up when Sarah walked in and his face broke into a huge smile. "Sarah," he called out. "Sarah Chen, is that really you?" "Hi Miguel," Sarah said, feeling tears threatening again. She seemed to cry so easily these days, overwhelmed by gratitude and emotion. Miguel came around the counter and pulled her into a tight hug that smelled like grease and spices and home. He held her at arm's length and looked her up and down. "Look at you," he said, "a nurse now. I heard about it, people talk, we're all so proud of you." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I couldn't have done it without a lot of help." The morning waitress, a young woman Sarah didn't recognize, approached with a friendly smile. Sarah asked for a booth, the one by the window where Robert had sat 2 years ago. She slid into the seat and accepted a menu, even though she already knew what she wanted. The waitress returned with coffee and Sarah ordered pancakes, the same thing Robert had ordered. When the food arrived, Sarah ate slowly, savoring the familiar taste and letting the memories wash over her. She thought about the Sarah who had worked here, who had served this same breakfast to dozens of customers, who had counted her tips with desperate hope at the end of each shift. She thought about Robert sitting in this exact spot, watching the street outside, writing in his leather notebook. Had he already made his decision then? Had he already known he was going to change her life? Or had he still been deciding, still evaluating whether she was worthy of his help? Sarah would never know for sure. Robert had taken some of his thoughts to the grave. But she knew what he had told her, that he saw in her the same quiet dignity her father had possessed, that he believed she had the strength and determination to transform her circumstances if given the opportunity. He had been right, she had proven him right. When Sarah finished eating, she sat for a while longer, watching the street outside just as Robert had done. The town was still struggling, still forgotten by the larger economic forces that had reshaped the country. But there were small signs of hope. A few new businesses had opened, the clinic was serving hundreds of patients. The people Robert had helped were building lives and contributing to the community. Change was slow, but it was happening. Sarah checked her watch and realized she needed to leave soon to pick up Emma from school. She signaled for the check and the young waitress brought it over with a smile. The total was $8.75, almost exactly what Robert's bill had been. Sarah pulled out her wallet and laid a $20 bill on the table. Then she pulled out a pen and one of her clinic business cards. On the back, she wrote a message in clear, careful letters. Your circumstances are not your destiny. You have more potential than you know. If you ever need help or resources, call this number, someone who believes in you. She placed the card on top of the 20 and stood up, taking one last look around the diner. Miguel waved from the grill and Sarah waved back, feeling a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. Outside, the September air was warm and the sky was blue and clear. Sarah climbed into her car, the same old Honda that had somehow survived these turbulent years, and started the engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the young waitress emerge from the diner, standing on the sidewalk holding the business card and staring after Sarah's car with an expression of confusion and hope. Sarah smiled and turned her attention back to the road. She didn't know if the waitress would call, didn't know if the gesture would mean anything or change anything. But that wasn't the point. The point was planting seeds, creating possibilities, offering hope to someone who might desperately need it. The point was paying forward what had been given to her, honoring Robert's memory by continuing his work in whatever small ways she could. Over the following months, Sarah settled into her role at the clinic and discovered a deep fulfillment in the work that surprised her with its intensity. Every patient was a person, every interaction an opportunity to provide not just medical care but dignity and respect. She learned their names and their stories, remembered details about their families and their struggles. Some of them reminded her so much of herself that it hurt, but it was a good hurt, a purposeful hurt that motivated her to do better and be better. The waitress from Magnolia's did call 3 weeks after Sarah's visit. Her name was Rachel and she was 23, working 2 jobs to support her younger brother after their parents died in a car accident. Sarah met her for coffee and listened to her story, offered advice and resources, connected her with some of the programs she had compiled in her growing database. Rachel was considering going back to school but didn't think she could afford it. Sarah told her about scholarships and grants, about work-study programs and community college options. She didn't offer money, that wasn't her place, and she didn't have Robert's resources, but she offered something equally valuable: information, encouragement, and the belief that a different life was possible. 6 months later, Rachel enrolled in community college to study business administration. She sent Sarah a text message with a photo of her acceptance letter and a string of excited emojis. Sarah saved the message and added Rachel's name to a private list she kept, people she had helped in small ways, lives she had touched. The list was growing slowly but steadily. Emma thrived in their new life with a confidence and security that broke Sarah's heart with its beauty. She made friends easily, excelled in school, and talked about wanting to be a doctor someday so she could help people like her mom did. Sarah encouraged her dreams while being careful not to pressure her, remembering what it felt like to have ambitions crushed by circumstances beyond her control. On the first anniversary of Sarah's start at the clinic, Dr. Okafor called her into the office and offered her a promotion to senior nurse with additional responsibilities and a significant raise. Sarah accepted with gratitude, feeling like each step forward was another validation of Robert's faith in her. That evening, Sarah drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried. His grave was in a beautiful spot under an old oak tree, marked by a simple headstone that read Robert Harrison, believer in human potential. Sarah had visited many times over the past year, always bringing flowers and always talking to Robert as if he could hear her. She told him about the promotion, about Emma's progress, about Rachel, and the other people she was helping in small ways. She told him about the clinic and the hundreds of patients they had served, about the difference his vision was making in their forgotten town. She told him she missed him, that she wished he could have lived long enough to see everything that had grown from the seeds he planted. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Sarah sat on the grass beside Robert's grave and let herself cry. She cried for the loss of a man who had become a friend and mentor. She cried for the life she had left behind and the struggles she would never forget. She cried from gratitude and exhaustion and the overwhelming weight of being given a second chance at life. When the tears finally stopped, Sarah felt cleansed and peaceful. She stood and brushed off her jeans, placed her hand on Robert's headstone for a moment, then walked back to her car. Emma was waiting at home, probably doing homework at the kitchen table, and Sarah wanted to be there to help her, to hear about her day, to be the kind of present and engaged mother that was only possible now that she wasn't drowning in desperation. 2 years after starting at the clinic, Sarah began teaching a health education class at the local community center, offering free information about nutrition and disease prevention and navigating the healthcare system. The classes were held on Wednesday evenings and attracted a mix of people, mostly working poor who didn't have access to this kind of education anywhere else. Sarah discovered she loved teaching, loved seeing people's faces light up when they understood something new about their own health and bodies. One evening after class, a woman in her 50s approached Sarah nervously. She introduced herself as Patricia and explained that she had been working as a housekeeper for 20 years but had always dreamed of becoming a medical assistant. Did Sarah think it was too late? Could someone her age really go back to school and start a new career? Sarah looked at Patricia and saw herself, saw the same hunger for something more, the same fear that the dream might be impossible. She took Patricia's hands in hers and looked her in the eyes. "It's not too late," Sarah said firmly. "I went back to school in my 30s with a young daughter and debts I could barely pay. If I can do it, you absolutely can do it. And I'm going to help you figure out how." Over the next several months, Sarah worked with Patricia the way Robert had worked with her, not by throwing money at the problem, but by providing guidance, information, and support. She helped Patricia research medical assistant programs, apply for financial aid, and create a budget that would allow her to work part-time while attending school. She connected Patricia with a scholarship program Robert had established before his death specifically for non-traditional students pursuing healthcare careers. When Patricia was accepted into the program and received the scholarship, she showed up at the clinic with tears streaming down her face and pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. "You changed my life," Patricia said. "You gave me hope when I thought I was stuck forever." Sarah hugged her back and felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the emotion that came from seeing her own transformation reflected in someone else. This was what Robert had given her, not just the money or the opportunity, but the understanding that one person's compassion could create ripples that changed lives across time and distance. "Pass it on," Sarah whispered. "When you're where you want to be, help someone else climb up behind you. That's how we change things." Emma turned 11 and started middle school, navigating the complicated social waters of adolescence with more confidence than Sarah had ever possessed at that age. She joined the school science club and talked about experiments and hypotheses over dinner. She asked Sarah questions about anatomy and disease that sometimes stumped her, sending Sarah to her old textbooks to find answers. Emma was bright and curious and kind, growing into a person Sarah was genuinely proud to know. One Saturday afternoon, Emma asked if they could visit Mr. Harrison's grave. Sarah was surprised but agreed, and they drove to the cemetery together with a bouquet of sunflowers that Emma had picked out at the grocery store. They stood at Robert's grave, and Emma placed the flowers carefully in the built-in vase. She was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered what was going through her daughter's mind. "I don't really remember him very well," Emma said finally. "I was pretty little when he died, but I know he helped us. I know he's the reason our life is different now." "He helped us a lot," Sarah confirmed. "He believed in people when they couldn't believe in themselves." Emma looked up at her mother with those serious eyes that sometimes seemed too old for her young face. "I want to be like that when I grow up," she said. "I want to help people the way he helped us, the way you help people now." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears for what seemed like the 1,000th time in the years since Robert had entered their lives. She pulled Emma close and kissed the top of her head. "You already are like that," Sarah said. "You have his heart, you have his belief in people, and you're going to do amazing things with your life." They stayed at the cemetery until the sun began to set, sitting on the grass and talking about school and friends and dreams for the future. Sarah told Emma more stories about Robert, about his kindness and his vision, about the way he had transformed not just their lives but dozens or hundreds of others. She wanted Emma to understand that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the differences you made, the compassion you showed. As they drove home, Emma was quiet in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the passing scenery. Then she turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she said, "do you think we're rich now?" Sarah considered the question carefully. They weren't poor anymore, that was true. The trust fund Robert had established for Emma's education was substantial. Sarah's salary at the clinic was comfortable enough to provide stability and even save a little money each month. But rich seemed like the wrong word. "I think we're blessed," Sarah said finally. "We have enough, which is more than we had before. We have security and opportunity and hope. That's a kind of richness that has nothing to do with money. Emma nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. Good, she said, because I don't want to forget what it was like before. I want to remember so I can help other people who are still there. Sarah reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, overwhelmed with love and pride. Robert's legacy was continuing through Emma now, through the values and compassion that Sarah was instilling in her daughter. The ripples spread ever outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. 3 years after starting at the clinic, Sarah was asked to speak at a local fundraiser for healthcare access. She was terrified of public speaking, but felt obligated to share her story, to give voice to the experience of being on both sides of poverty and privilege. She spent weeks preparing her remarks, writing and rewriting, practicing in front of Emma and Lisa until the words felt natural. The night of the fundraiser, Sarah stood at a podium in front of a room full of community leaders and donors and told her story. She talked about working at Magnolia's Diner, about the constant stress of never having enough, about the shame and exhaustion of poverty. She talked about the day Robert walked into the diner and left no tip, about the mysterious text messages and the envelope under the piano. She talked about his belief in her potential, about the opportunity he had given her, about the transformation of her life. But mostly she talked about what she had learned from Robert, about the power of strategic compassion and the ripple effects of helping people access opportunity. She talked about the clinic and the lives it touched, about the patients who came in desperate and left with hope. She talked about the responsibility that came with being helped, the obligation to pay it forward and create more ripples. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause and Sarah saw tears on many faces. Several people approached her afterward to share their own stories of struggle and transformation, to thank her for her vulnerability and honesty. The fundraiser exceeded its goal by 30%, money that would go toward expanding the clinic services. Dr. Akafer pulled Sarah aside before she left that evening and told her she had a gift for connecting with people, for making them understand the human reality behind abstract concepts like poverty and healthcare access. She encouraged Sarah to keep speaking, to keep sharing her story, to become an advocate for the kind of systemic change that Robert had believed in. Sarah drove home that night feeling exhausted but energized, scared but purposeful. She was stepping into a role she had never imagined for herself, becoming not just a nurse but a voice for people who had no voice, a bridge between the world of poverty she had lived in and the world of resources and power that could make a difference. The seasons turned and the years accumulated, and Sarah's life continued to unfold in ways that filled her with gratitude and purpose. She became known in the community as someone who helped people navigate systems and access resources. She continued her health education classes and started a support group for single mothers trying to improve their circumstances. She mentored nursing students and spoke at conferences and wrote articles about the intersection of poverty and healthcare. Emma grew into a remarkable young woman, accepted into a prestigious university with plans to study medicine. The trust fund Robert had established would cover her tuition and expenses, freeing her from the burden of student debt that crushed so many young people. Emma talked about becoming a doctor who served underserved communities, about continuing the work that Mr. Harrison had started and her mother had continued. On the 5th anniversary of Robert's death, the clinic held a memorial event celebrating his legacy and the impact of his vision. Hundreds of people attended, patients and staff and community members whose lives had been touched by Robert's generosity or the services the clinic provided. Sarah was asked to give the keynote speech, and she stood before the crowd and talked about the man who had changed everything. She told the story again, the one that had become central to her identity, about the billionaire who left no tip but left something far more valuable. She talked about the piano and the envelope and the conversation that followed, about Robert's understanding that poverty wasn't a personal failure but a systemic problem that could be addressed with strategic help and genuine compassion. But she also talked about what Robert had taught her through his example, lessons that went beyond money and opportunity. He taught her that every person has inherent worth and potential regardless of their current circumstances. He taught her that compassion without action is empty, but action without compassion is hollow. He taught her that change happens one life at a time, one ripple spreading outward to create more ripples in patterns that become waves. She talked about the responsibility that came with receiving help, the obligation to recognize that you were no more deserving than the person still struggling, that luck and timing and opportunity played enormous roles in who succeeded and who didn't. She talked about the importance of staying connected to your own experience of hardship, of never forgetting what it felt like to be on the other side, of using that memory as fuel for empathy and action. And she talked about paying it forward, about the dozens of small ways she tried every day to honor Robert's memory by helping others. She talked about Rachel and Patricia and the countless patients at the clinic who she tried to see as full human beings deserving of dignity and respect. She talked about Emma and the values she was trying to instill, about raising a daughter who understood that privilege came with responsibility. When Sarah finished speaking, the crowd rose in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. People were crying and smiling, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by the love and community in that room, by the evidence of Robert's vision spreading ever outward through time and space. After the event, as people were gathering for refreshments and conversation, a young man approached Sarah nervously. He introduced himself as James and explained that he was one of Robert's recipients, that Robert had funded his college education and helped him start a small business. The business had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and now James wanted to start his own version of Robert's legacy project, helping other young entrepreneurs in the community. He asked Sarah for advice, for guidance on how to identify people with potential, how to provide help without creating dependency, how to measure impact and ensure accountability. Sarah spent an hour talking with James, sharing everything she had learned from Robert and from her own experience of helping others. When they finished, James thanked her and said he would stay in touch, that he wanted her input as he developed his program. Sarah watched James walk away and felt a profound sense of continuity, of Robert's vision living on through people like James and Emma and herself, through the countless others who had been touched by his generosity and were now paying it forward in their own ways. This was how change happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through persistent, compassionate action compounded over time. That night, Sarah sat on her couch with Emma beside her, watching a movie they had both seen a dozen times. Emma's head rested on Sarah's shoulder and Sarah breathed in the familiar smell of her daughter's shampoo, overwhelmed with gratitude for the ordinary miracle of this moment. 5 years ago, she couldn't have imagined this life, this peace, this security. 5 years ago, she was drowning in desperation with no way to imagine a different future. "Mom," Emma said during a quiet moment in the movie, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Mr. Harrison hadn't helped us?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. I prefer to think about what I'm going to do with the chance he gave me, how I'm going to make sure his gift keeps spreading." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I think you're doing a good job with that," she said softly. Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head and felt tears threaten again, those ever-present tears of gratitude and emotion. "I hope so," she whispered. "I really hope so." The next morning was a Tuesday, and Sarah woke early to prepare for her shift at the clinic. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her scrubs and checking her appearance, and thought about how different this moment was from similar mornings 5 years ago. Then she had been tying her apron at Magnolia's Diner, facing another day of exhausting work and meager tips. Now she was preparing for another day of meaningful work, of helping people and making a difference. But in some ways, Sarah realized, the core of who she was hadn't changed at all. She was still the same woman who worked hard and cared about people and tried to do her best despite difficult circumstances. Robert hadn't created a different person, he had simply removed the barriers that prevented her from becoming who she already was. He had provided the opportunity for her potential to flourish. That understanding felt important, a key insight that Sarah wanted to carry with her. When she helped other people, when she connected them with resources and opportunities, she wasn't saving them or fixing them. She was simply removing barriers and creating space for them to save themselves, to access the strength and potential they already possessed. Sarah drove to the clinic through the familiar streets of her town, past Magnolia's Diner where the lights were already on and the breakfast shift was beginning. She thought about stopping in, about checking on Rachel and Miguel and the others, but decided against it. She had moved forward and that was okay, that was healthy. She could honor her past without being trapped by it. The clinic parking lot was already filling up with patients, people arriving for early morning appointments or hoping to be seen as walk-ins. Sarah recognized some of the faces, regular patients whose lives she had become part of through repeated visits and ongoing care. She waved at Mrs. Johnson, who was managing her diabetes with remarkable discipline. She smiled at young Tyler, whose asthma was finally under control thanks to proper medication and education. Inside, the clinic hummed with its usual organized chaos. Dr. Acaffer was already in her office reviewing charts. Jennifer was setting up exam rooms. The front desk staff was checking in patients and updating records. Sarah joined the flow of activity, checking the schedule and preparing for the day ahead. Her first patient was a new face, a woman about Sarah's age with the worn-down look of someone carrying too many burdens. Her name was Michelle, and she was there for a physical exam required by a new job, a warehouse position that didn't pay much but was better than nothing. As Sarah took Michelle's vital signs and medical history, she listened to the familiar story of struggle. of working multiple jobs and raising kids alone and trying to stay afloat. Sarah saw herself in Michelle, saw the exhaustion and the determination, the quiet strength that poverty required. When the exam was finished and Dr. Okafor had signed off on the paperwork, Sarah pulled Michelle aside. "I know this might seem forward," Sarah said gently, "but I've been where you are. If you ever need help navigating resources or figuring out how to access opportunities, I have information that might be useful. Would you be open to talking sometime?" Michelle looked at her with surprise and then with tears welling up. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would really appreciate that." Sarah gave Michelle one of her cards with her personal cell phone number written on the back. "No pressure," Sarah said. "Just reach out if you want to talk." As Michelle left, Sarah felt that familiar sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to do. This was Robert's legacy living through her. The ripples spreading ever outward, touching lives in ways that would create more ripples in patterns too complex to predict or measure. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm of patience and problems and small victories. Sarah administered vaccines and dressed wounds and listened to people's stories with genuine attention and care. She offered medical advice and also practical advice, information about food banks and utility assistance and job training programs. She treated each person as a full human being deserving of dignity, just as she wished she had been treated during her own years of struggle. During her lunch break, Sarah sat in the staff room and checked her phone. There was a message from Emma with a photo of her science project. There was a message from Rachel saying she had been promoted at her job. There was a message from James with an update on his new program to help young entrepreneurs. And there was a message from an unknown number. Sarah opened it and read the simple words, "Thank you for the card and the encouragement. I'm going to look into going back to school. You gave me hope, Michelle." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, feeling that overwhelming surge of emotion that had become so familiar. This was why she did this work. This was what Robert had understood. One person's compassion, one moment of genuine care and attention, could plant a seed that grew into something beautiful and unpredictable. She typed back a response. "You've got this. I believe in you. Let me know if you need help figuring out the process." When her shift ended that evening, Sarah drove to pick up Emma from her after-school science club. They stopped at the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner, and Sarah let Emma pick out a treat from the bakery section. They drove home through the autumn twilight, and Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. This was her life now, ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. She had a job she loved, a daughter who was thriving, security and stability and hope for the future. But she also had a mission, a purpose that went beyond her own comfort and happiness. She was part of a movement larger than herself, a ripple effect of compassion that had started with her father's kindness to a desperate teenage boy and continued through Robert's strategic generosity, and now through her own daily efforts to help others. That evening, after dinner was cleaned up and homework was completed, Sarah sat down at her laptop and opened the document where she tracked the people she was helping. Michelle's name was added to the list, along with a note about her situation and potential resources. The list had grown to over 50 names now, people at various stages of their journeys toward stability and success. Sarah also maintained a separate document, a kind of ongoing letter to Robert that she added to regularly. She told him about the clinic and the patients and the people she was helping. She told him about Emma's progress and her own professional development. She told him about the ways his legacy was continuing to spread, about James and the others who were starting their own programs. Tonight she wrote about Michelle, about the moment of connection and the message of gratitude, about the small seed of hope that had been planted. She wrote about her own continuing journey of growth and healing, about how helping others helped her process her own experience of struggle. She wrote about her gratitude, her profound and endless gratitude for the chance he had given her. When she finished writing, Sarah closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The neighborhood was peaceful, lights glowing in windows, families settling in for the evening. Sarah thought about all the individual lives happening in those homes, each with their own struggles and dreams and potential. She thought about the vast, complicated web of human connection and interdependence, about how each person's actions rippled outward in ways they could never fully see or understand. She thought about her father showing kindness to a suicidal teenager, about that teenager growing up to become a billionaire who helped hundreds of people, about those people going on to help others in turn. The patterns were infinite and beautiful and humbling. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message, this time from Patricia, the woman who had gone back to school to become a medical assistant. She had just passed her certification exam and wanted Sarah to know. Sarah sent back congratulations and encouragement, adding Patricia's success to the mental tally of victories she celebrated. This was her life now, woven into the lives of others, connected through threads of compassion and support and shared humanity. She was no longer alone struggling in isolation, but part of a community bound together by Robert's vision and their own commitment to paying it forward. Emma appeared in the doorway of the living room, ready for bed, and Sarah turned away from the window to focus on her daughter. They went through their nighttime routine, brushing teeth and picking out clothes for tomorrow and talking about the day. Sarah tucked Emma in and read her a chapter from the book they were working through, even though Emma was really too old for bedtime stories. But both of them cherished this ritual, this quiet time together before sleep. As Sarah turned out the light and pulled Emma's door closed, she paused in the hallway and thought about how many times she had done this simple action. Thousands of times over the years, in different apartments and houses, under different circumstances. But the love had remained constant, the fierce protective love of a mother for her child. That love was what had kept Sarah going during the hardest years, what had motivated her to accept Robert's help even when pride made her want to refuse, what drove her now to work so hard to help others. She wanted to create a world where Emma and children like her had access to opportunity regardless of their circumstances, where potential wasn't wasted because of poverty or systemic barriers. Sarah walked to her own bedroom and got ready for bed, tired from the long day but satisfied with the work she had done. Before turning out her light, she looked at the framed photograph on her nightstand. It showed her and Emma and Robert, taken about 6 months before his death. They were at the clinic's groundbreaking ceremony, all three smiling at the camera, Emma holding a miniature shovel that was almost as big as she was. Robert looked frail but happy in the photograph, his eyes bright with vision and purpose. Sarah remembered that day vividly, the sense of excitement and possibility, the feeling that something important was beginning. She had been so grateful and so scared, uncertain whether she could live up to Robert's faith in her. Now, 5 years later, Sarah knew she had lived up to that faith. She had become the person Robert believed she could be, and she was helping others become the people they could be. The ripples continued spreading, generation after generation, life after life, creating patterns of transformation that would outlast any single person. Sarah turned out the light and settled into bed, her body heavy with exhaustion but her heart light with purpose. Tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again, serving patience and planting seeds of hope, paying forward what had been given to her. And the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as she was able. This was her calling, her mission, her way of honoring the man who had changed everything by seeing potential where others saw only limitations. Robert Harrison had left her no tip that day at Magnolia's diner, but he had left her something infinitely more valuable. The belief that her circumstances did not define her destiny, that she had the strength and potential to transform her life, and that having been helped, she had the responsibility to help others in turn. The note under the piano had changed everything, but what it really contained was a mirror, reflecting back to Sarah the person she had always been capable of becoming. And now, through her daily work and her commitment to others, Sarah was holding up that mirror for people like Michelle and Rachel and Patricia, showing them their own potential, offering them their own chance at transformation. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude, not to any specific deity but to the universe itself, to the mysterious forces that had brought Robert into her life at exactly the moment she needed him. She was grateful for the struggle that taught her empathy. She was grateful for the help that showed her possibility. She was grateful for the opportunity to pay it forward. And somewhere in her dreams, Sarah imagined Robert smiling with that knowing expression he had worn so often, pleased that his investment had yielded exactly the return he had hoped for. Not just one life transformed, but dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands as the ripples spread ever outward through time and space and human connection, proving his theory that with the right help at the right moment, people could transcend their circumstances and become agents of change themselves. The story that had begun with $0 on a diner table had become a story about the immeasurable wealth of compassion, about the compound interest of kindness, about the way one person's vision could transform a community by transforming individual lives. And that story was still being written, would continue being written through Sarah and Emma, and all the others who carried forward Robert's legacy of believing in human potential and acting on that belief with strategic generosity and genuine love. In the morning, Sarah would wake up and continue the work. But for now, she slept peacefully, her dreams filled with images of ripples spreading across still water, each one touching countless others in patterns too beautiful and complex to fully comprehend, but real and powerful nonetheless, changing the world one life at a time. Changing the world one life at a time.